Christian apologists do not have the corner on bad takes on the Bible. Don't get me wrong, pop apologists are very often the worst. In my experience, people like Frank Turek, Lee Strobel, J. Warner Wallace, and their followers are more akin to a stopped clock, right exactly twice a day, if that. But I would be remiss if on this channel I didn't tackle some of the rather poor takes on the Bible that come from my own camp. In case you weren't aware, I'm an atheist. So, to that end, I want to look at a meme that I came across about a year or so ago from the Facebook group Exposing Religion. There you have it, folks. How ridiculous of the Bible to claim Paul was heading somewhere that, at that time, just didn't even exist. I bet you Christians feel really silly now, don't you? It might be hard to detect, but I am being facetious. The Exposing Religion Facebook group has posted some of the most cringeworthy, dumbest memes I've ever encountered. Like this one. And this one. And this one. Now, I understand memes aren't meant to be treatises. They aren't essays complete with arguments and citations. But given the emphasis exposing religion places on reason and evidence, you'd think the quality of their memes would be a little bit higher. And yet, here we are. But that doesn't mean we can't use this as a teaching moment. So, what is going on with Paul's references to Spain? Despite the picture painted in the Acts of the Apostles, the one painted by the undisputed Pauline epistles is of an apostle who was prone to spontaneity. As J. Alpert Harrell notes, Paul canceled whole trips and vacillated about his travel plans. This doesn't mean Paul was disorganized or otherwise sloppy. If anything, this spontaneity was a product of his worldview. You know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near, he tells Christ followers in Rome, in Romans chapter 13, verses 11 and 12. Paul was an apocalypticist. For him, as for the Jesus he loved and followed, the current age was on the verge of breaking into a new one. God's reign was soon to commence, and there was work to be done. His firm belief that he lived and worked in history's final hour is absolutely foundational, shaping everything else that Paul says and does, notes historian Paula Fredrickson. The stakes were high for Paul since he believed that judgment was coming, and the only escape for the pagans found throughout the Roman Empire was through the Messiah of the God of Israel, Jesus. Early in his apostolic career, probably in the 30s and 40s CE, Paul seems to have been content to remain in and around the Roman province of Syria, which at that time included not only cities like Damascus, but also Jerusalem in Judea. But sometime around 50 CE, his trajectory shifts westward. In what is likely his latest extant letter, that to the Romans, he tells his audience that he had been sent by Christ to win obedience from the Gentiles by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and as far around as Illyricum I have fully proclaimed the good news of Christ. Jerusalem most people can place on a map, Illyricum may be less familiar, but was a Roman province that was situated on the Balkan Peninsula along the Adriatic Sea. Across the Adriatic was Italy, and the empire's capital city of Rome. But why this shift to the west? After describing his general activity from Jerusalem to Illyricum, Paul tells the Romans, "Thus I make it my ambition to proclaim the good news, not where Christ has already been named, so that I do not build on someone else's foundation." So, Paul's impulse was to head west into regions where the good news of Jesus Christ had not reached. He went to Galatia, Thessalonica, Corinth, Philippi, and more. But not Rome, for precisely the reasons he mentioned. He didn't want to build on someone else's foundation. He says in Romans chapter 15, verse 22, "This is the reason that I have been so often hindered from coming to you." Paul didn't originate the Christ-following community in Rome. Historians aren't exactly sure who did. The origins of Christianity in Rome are obscure, notes New Testament scholar Leander Keck. Regardless of how it first formed, on the evidence of Romans chapter 16, the Apostle Paul knew several people in the community there. Prisca and Aquila, Andronicus and Junia, relatives of Paul, Herodian, another relative, and many more. We can be relatively confident that even if Paul had not yet been to Rome, he was probably well known among the Christ followers there. But now, Paul writes in Romans chapter 15, verses 23 through 24, "With no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain." According to verses 25 through 27, he must first make a stop at Jerusalem to deliver a collection for the poor he had been amassing in his travels. Earlier letters to the Corinthians make mention of this collection. It was of primary importance to him. "So when I have completed this, and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will set out by way of you to Spain," Paul says in Romans chapter 15, verse 28. Spain? I was under the impression that Spain didn't even exist until 1479, well over 1400 years after Paul kicked the bucket. The word rendered Spain in virtually all English translations of Romans chapter 15, verses 24 and 28, is a transliteration of the Greek word Spania. In the 1st century CE, Spania would have included what is today Spain and Portugal, and had been under Roman control since the end of the Second Punic War, a few centuries prior. In his entry on Spain for the Anchor Bible Dictionary, Warren Hurd writes, "Besides wealth, Spain made many substantial contributions to Rome. 5 Caesars came from this geographic region, along with a host of literary greats." But what about Spain made it such an attractive prospect for Paul? In his commentary on Romans, Robert Jewett suggests 3 reasons. First, Spain was thoroughly pagan. It lacked any Jewish population and remained stubbornly resistant to Greco-Roman culture, Jewett observes. In Paul's terms, no one had yet laid there any foundation. It was the perfect place to bring the gospel. Second, Spain was the natural conclusion to the northern circuit along the Mediterranean Sea. James Dunn wrote in his commentary on Romans, "If we follow the image of the arc of a circle used by Paul in Romans 15, verse 19, The obvious extension of the arc was a sweep through Italy into Spain. Dunn suggests that Paul perhaps had a grand design to cover the areas of the northern Mediterranean while leaving areas south of it for others to evangelize. Third, Spain may have had eschatological connotations. In Isaiah chapter 66, Yahweh, through the prophet, declares that he will gather all nations and tongues, so that they may witness his glory in Jerusalem. To that end, in verse 19, he says, I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Put, and Lud, which draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan. Working backwards, Javan is likely a reference to Ionia or Greece. Both Tubal and Lud were in Asia Minor. Put, or Pul, is a reference to an area in Libya. That leaves us with Tarshish. To what does it refer? Though there is some debate over the location, many scholars place it in Spain, identifying it with the Phoenician city of Tartessus. If missionaries had already reached places like Put, Lud, Tubal, and Javan, this would mean that only Tarshish in Spain remained. By bringing the gospel there, Jewett writes, Paul would provide the final offering of the Gentiles, and thus complete the eschatological mission before the parousia. This ties in with what Paul told the Romans earlier in his letter, that Israel's salvation would happen once the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Paula Fredrickson traces this idea of the full number of the Gentiles to the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. There we find the descendants of the sons of Noah, 70 nations in all. Dispersed by God following the deluge, they would be regathered per Isaiah chapter 66, verse 19. And if we cross-reference the 5 names listed in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 19, with the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, we find that all 5 can be found there. Again, perhaps Paul thought that by going to Spain, that he would bring in the full number of the Gentiles, and, subsequently, usher in the end. It isn't clear that Paul made it to Spain. There is a reference in 1 Clement to Paul reaching the farthest limits of the West, but that isn't clear either. Regardless, it was Paul's intention to go to Spain after a brief layover in Rome. Spain was a real place in Paul's day. If the skeptics over at Exposing Religion want to challenge their unbelieving interlocutors, then they better step up their game. At this point, they just look ignorant, wantonly so. Denying the existence of Spain in the 1st century CE? What's next? Denying the existence of Jesus?